Hey guys, welcome back to U.S. History. Today, we're going to talk about Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and the Scopes monkey trial. President Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat who served as president from 1913 to 1921. Unfortunately for his party, he happened to not only be the president responsible for taking the U.S. into World War I, but also as the man in charge during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which was the 100 years ago version of COVID. Warren Harding, a Republican, ran on a platform of bringing the country back to normal. He wins the election and immediately has to get to work trying to start the recovery and healing process. For most presidents, those would be big enough tasks in and of themselves. But for Harding, most of his problems were not actually issues with his domestic presidential agenda, but with accusations of corruption. After becoming president, Harding appointed a lot of his closest political allies, biggest campaign donors, and friends to powerful positions within his administration. Since most of them knew Harding from their time in Ohio politics, they were often referred to as the Ohio Gang. One of Harding's most powerful allies was Harry Dougherty, who he appointed as Attorney General, the position responsible for investigating and prosecuting government corruption. This essentially guaranteed that Harding himself would never be prosecuted. Another one of his major allies was Albert Fall, a former senator from Ohio who Harding appointed as the Secretary of the Interior. Now, normally, Secretary of the Interior is not considered a powerful or desirable job, but Fall knew that he could use it to enrich himself in private. If you go back and remember from the last unit, one of the things that progressives cared about the most was the preservation and conservation of America's natural resources, especially from exploitation by big corporations. When Taft had been president, he designated 7 areas as oil reserves for the U.S. Navy so that they could convert coal into fuel oil in a process known as liquefaction. One of these areas was called the Teapot Dome oil field in Wyoming. But shortly after becoming president, Harding signed an executive order transferring management of Teapot Dome from the U.S. Navy to the Interior Department, and, well, I think you can see where this is going. In 1922, Fall leased the oil production rights for Teapot Dome to Harry Sinclair and Mammoth Oil, and the terms of the lease were very favorable. In return, the executives from Mammoth Oil repaid Fall with a private no-interest loan worth $1.5 million in today's money. He also received another $6 million from gifts by Sinclair and oil executives. The sad thing is, he probably would have gotten away with it because that's often how government corruption works. But Fall couldn't help himself. He used that money to drastically improve his own standard of living, and the people around him noticed. He started driving fancy cars and living in a much nicer house. And he also paid off 10 years worth of back taxes on his ranch. A salty oil operator from Wyoming wrote to his senator that Fall had given a too-fair deal to a rival company. Soon after, a full-scale investigation was underway in the Senate, and an up-and-coming journalist provided extra details about Fall's new standard of living. This whole affair came to be known as the Teapot Dome scandal and would become a symbol for government corruption. In fact, it was probably the scandal to mention for about 50 years. Then Richard Nixon got himself in some hot water with the Watergate scandal, but we'll get to that later. There's honestly not a lot to say about presidential politics and policy in the 1920s besides that it was filled with suspicion and corruption. Harding himself didn't even last his term, although it wasn't because of the corruption. Harding was actually liked and admired by most of the country, and the scandal stuff was resolved with Albert Fall taking the fall and being the only person charged. But a year later, Harding suffered a heart attack in office while on a trip to California. After his death, Calvin Coolidge, Harding's vice president, was sworn into office and served the rest of his term, as well as one of his own, after winning re-election. The 1920s were dominated by Republican presidents, first Harding, then Coolidge, and eventually Hoover by the end of the decade. Largely speaking, their policies in the economic arena could best be boiled down to what was known as trickle-down economics, or at least that's what it would come to be known as about 50 years later under President Ronald Reagan. Sticking with the flow of turn-of-the-century economic policy, most of the approach aligned with social Darwinism. The government mostly stayed out of the economy with low taxes on the rich and very little regulation for the stock market. And while modern economic theory tells us that that's actually not the best idea, in the short term, it usually works. So the 1920s were a period of economic growth in America with a surge in economic activity and businesses gaining immense wealth. But, as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end, and the Great Depression was waiting just around the corner. But speaking of Darwinism, let's go back to what Darwinism was actually about: evolution. In 1859, Darwin had published his book, On the Origin of Species, to elaborate on his theory of evolution and to try to explain the origin of man. According to Darwin, living beings compete for resources like food, with the fittest surviving and passing on their traits to their descendants, and the weaker beings dying out. Over time, those strong genes continue to thrive and adapt, and the weak genes get eliminated entirely, leading to a general process of evolution. If you'll remember from the previous unit, one of the biggest pushes during this turn-of-the-century era was a push toward improved morality in the American public. Most of the ramifications of that would come to fruition during the Prohibition era because of the banning of alcohol. But part of that was a push toward returning America to its quote-unquote traditional Christian beliefs, especially in the South. Though it still exists to a large extent today, Christian fundamentalism was extremely prevalent in the 1920s. Fundamentalist Christians believed that God created all things, the Bible was directly inspired by God, and that the creation narrative in the Bible should be interpreted literally as 7 days of creation. Because of this literalist view, many fundamentalists rejected the teaching of evolution because they believed it was irreconcilable with their interpretation of the Bible. Many secularists, however, believed that living things evolved over time and originated from non-living things, a process called abiogenesis. Most of these secularists were atheists, agnostics, or deists who believed that the Bible was a collection of writings and myths, not God's word. Even with Christians, not everyone agreed with one another. While fundamentalists believed Darwinism went against their faith, other followers of Christianity, such as modernists, believed that the Bible wasn't meant to be taken literally, and felt that Darwinism was therefore compatible with Christianity. Since fundamentalist Christians were in the majority, they strongly pushed for rules that would prevent the teaching of evolution in the classroom. The last thing that they wanted was for little Billy to be taught at home and at church that God created humans 7,000 years ago, and then go to school and have a teacher undermine that by suggesting that perhaps humans weren't created but actually evolved over time. Despite it being blatantly unconstitutional, and despite the public school curriculum actually including a chapter on evolution, Tennessee banned the teaching of evolution in school in March of 1925. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, a staunch defender of American civil rights, wanted to test this law and have it overturned in court. They recruited John Scopes, a biology teacher, to allegedly go against the law and teach about evolution in his biology class. Scopes was put on trial for breaking Tennessee law, and the trial gained a lot of publicity. Scopes was represented by Clarence Darrow, a leading ACLU attorney who would go on to become famous for his defense in criminal and civil rights trials. The state of Tennessee was represented by William Jennings Bryan. Yep, the same William Jennings Bryan who was known as that lovable loser who couldn't win an election even if he was the only one running. Fortunately for Bryan, his problems with losing seemed to be limited to the political arena. In the Scopes trial, he won his prosecution, and Scopes was found guilty and ordered to pay a $100 fine, which is about $1,500 in today's money. Though Scopes' conviction would later be thrown out, and he eventually admitted to not even having taught evolution in his class to begin with, the Scopes trial set a precedent. This precedent would last a few decades, and it signaled to other Southern conservative fundamentalist states that it was okay to make laws that violated the First Amendment's free exercise clause, as long as you were the one in the majority. Well, that's all for now. Next time, we'll learn about the rapid advances of technology as a result of World War I and how the world rapidly shifted in the 1920s. See you next time.